Hello, and welcome to the Schmidt List, the podcast for people dedicated to managing successful projects, developing impactful products, and building engaged teams. And now, here's your host, Kurt Schmidt.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another exciting edition of the Schmidt List. Today, I'll be talking to Zack Naylor, co-founder of Aurelius. We discuss how to break through the fog of UX research and why, even if you're the best designer in the world, you still need to deploy empathy in order to make a significant impact in your role. For some reason, we also veer off into a Kingdom of the Crystal Skull metaphor and some other weird stuff, but it's a really fun conversation, and I really hope you enjoy it. Zack, thanks for joining me today on the show.
My pleasure.
So you and I have worked together in the past, and I'm glad to have you here because I want to talk about your history in user experience, and then also the product you're working on, and then what it's like to work on designing a tool for designers, because I'm sure that's got its own challenges. So with that, tell me a bit about how you got into design as a profession.
It's pretty straightforward. I actually went to the Art Institute of Pittsburgh. That's where I'm from. Oh, geez. Back in that day, the degree I signed up for was multimedia design.
Yeah. I think mine was simpler, yeah.
Multimedia. Well, technically, I'm trying to remember. Right before I graduated, they changed it to interactive media design.
Yeah, that was the new hotness.
Oh, yeah, sure. Mm-hmm. Well, basically, though, I mean, the reason I got into that started in high school. What I wanted to do more than anything else. So, do you remember Macromedia Director? Do you remember that program?
Oh, I do.
I loved that.
Yeah.
Right, and I wanted to make stuff like the interactive screens at the beginning of DVDs and CD-ROMs. Mm-hmm. You remember when they used to send those in the mail?
Oh, that was my first. That was my first real job. Was making CD-ROMs with Authorware. And so Director.
The super the cool animated stuff in the beginnings.
Which I totally dated myself right there.
Yeah, well, but that was the stuff that was extremely interesting.
Oh yeah,
I was like,
that was the After Effects of the day.
Sure, and then so what happened was I went to school for that. And it was a 50-50 degree. So you did that kind of stuff, but then you also did web design. And what I realized while I was going through school is that I actually really like web design more, and I saw that was the future.
Yeah.
The future. Web design was the future.
You didn't think this physical media would last long?
It sounds like such a wild thing to even say.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so what happened was I then, I graduated. I actually started my career as a front-end developer and visual designer. Mm-hmm. And the biggest reason for that was because those were the tools and skills that I was given in school, right? Mm-hmm. And I guess fast forward, I was a pretty good front-end developer. I was an okay visual designer. I felt like a lot of the design I was doing was not about the aesthetics or the visual layout or the brand application, and I didn't have a good language for that. So fast forward a couple years, I got hired at a company called ModCloth. They were still a startup at the time, relatively recently in the last few years, got purchased by Walmart, in fact, but they were still headquartered in Pittsburgh. They were 50 people at the time. I was the first interaction designer they were hired. And there was where I really, I started getting this language that applied to the work that I was doing. And then I read everything I could about user research and self-taught in that regard. And I was doing things which today we would call guerrilla research or lean research. We didn't call it that then.
You were doing design in production.
Well, exactly. And so what I did, though, is I sketched stuff on my notebook, and I drove to our fulfillment warehouse that was about 40 minutes down the road. And I showed those because I was working on the back-end fulfillment system of this e-commerce retailer, right? And I would show them, and because that was the only way I knew how to do my job. I knew, back then, I knew I didn't have all the answers. I had to get some feedback from people who would actually be using this thing. Yeah, and then fast forward, did the startup rodeo a little bit there back in Pittsburgh, a couple other places. Eventually came here to Minneapolis at the Nerdery, which is where you and I met. And, I think one of the reasons they brought me on was because of my research and strategy background. They wanted to build that practice, and so I helped do that there. And, we worked with everybody from somebody in their basement with a dream all the way up to the boardroom of a Fortune 500 company. So doing that kind of work. And more, I guess, what I realized is that I worked farther back, so quote unquote, in the process, where now a lot of the stuff that I tend to focus on is what should we be designing, and are we designing and making the right things, as opposed to the actual day-to-day interaction design and stuff like that.
And so with that, was that where you kind of, through that process, got the inspiration or uncovered the problem of what your product Aurelius is addressing? Is that kind of the natural progression of that?
So it's a really good That's a really good point that I think you took out of that. And if I were to pinpoint it, I think the idea I had for Aurelius definitely stemmed from my time at the Nerdery, and really kind of came up more manifested in the job I had after that.
Okay.
So, so here's what happened, right? Is I left the Nerdery, I took this director of UX job at another company. And what I was realizing there, and sort of some of my tail end tenure at the Nerdery, was that like the work that I was doing was not just making a thing for you. What I realized after seeing client after client after project was that I can teach anybody how to design, right? I can teach anybody how to use a tool for design. I can teach anybody how to do front-end code, whatever that might be. The value that I felt like I always brought was making sure we were making the right things. That's so much harder and in many ways so much more valuable. I'm biased, but I think that that's very, very important work to do. So I guess, long story short, like what I saw was that we had tons of people coming to us at the Nerdery. I want to make a new iPad sales app. Great. We've literally heard this story dozens of times before. And then when we ask, well, why? What does this help your business do? What does it help those people who you're trying to serve do? And there's no real answers there, but you have $500,000 budget to do this. It's like, wait a minute. We can put that to much better work. So yes, my passion was really around directing that time, effort, dollars to something that really, really mattered, both for you and for the people you're trying to serve.
Yeah, that's funny you say that because, I mean, that's something that working with clients these days at Foundry, we do have people show up with budgets for problems that we find very quickly thereafter that's not really the problem, and they put a price on what they think the problem is when it actually could be not a $500,000 problem, but it could be a $30,000 problem. It could be a $3,000 problem.
Totally. Yeah, and it's that's another really, really good point too, because one of the things that can happen is I think people have an apprehension to slow down. Everybody is in such a hurry to build something, to make something. There's a couple reasons for that. One being the tools and processes and ways to enable that are so easy now. That's one reason for that. But the other one is because, as human beings, interesting book I kind of got this from, and a lot of the philosophy I've based my work and kind of thinking off of, called Drive, by Dan Pink.
Yep.
Yeah, so it talks about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation, basic internal, external motivation, right? A lot of people are externally motivated, and that's why. It's not a bad thing, but it's just to say they don't feel like they've accomplished something until they have something in their hand, right? And so then the work you're talking about to figure out the thing to make doesn't elicit a sense of progress or accomplishment for them. So I think it's like hard to. And so anyway, not that you asked, but I think the way we get around that is by helping people very clearly see how you're actually still achieving the thing you're trying to achieve. But yes, to your point, it may actually cost you less if you do this work, if you apply this kind of thinking to that.
Right, and that's where you see, I mean, from back in the day, why this agile process kind of took more hold, because I could deliver in shorter increments and get that dopamine hit, as you will.
Yeah.
Of like, we're making progress, things are happening, and I'm relevant, my job is secure, and all those other things that are really the human side of the work that we're doing, right? I mean, you've got politics and you've got budgets and you've got people that want to keep their jobs. You got people that want to move up the ladder. All this is happening while you're still trying to deliver on a software product, right? And there's a farce to it because people see these products just appear like a Trello or something, and they're like, oh my gosh, Trello's so great. But they don't know like how many years of work went into the original idea. If you look at it, it's terrible. And it's the same thing I just heard on Seth Godin's new podcast, where he talks about people are so apt to move into this world of awesomeness, but go back and listen to Jerry Seinfeld's original stand-up tapes. You know, he's not good. You know, it's not that great. And I think he played like clips from Billy Joel's demos, and it's like, no,
it doesn't start that way.
Right.
Well, and so again,
but I'm a big company and I got this big budget. I'm going to just throw a bunch of money and people at it.
Yeah.
Or I'm going to throw, if it's a bigger company, I'm going to throw IDEO at it, right? And they're just going to smear design thinking all over it. And
just like peanut butter.
Yeah, just Like, yeah, smooth, like just delicious, delicious design thinking, right?
Sure.
And that's gonna address it.
It's again, I appreciate the point that you're bringing up here. I don't know if you're baiting me, Kurt, but consider bait taken. Consider the bait taken.
Do I look like a person who would bait?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right, that's fair. I resemble that remark.
So what you're getting at is, yes, you started with this whole idea of Agile. Yep, that was super successful. There's different reasons why Agile was successful. There's different reasons why, a super large company hires somebody like an IDEO, whatever. Let's take a step back here and just acknowledge the facts for the facts. Now, nobody could have necessarily predicted this. Maybe people smarter than I am could have, but Agile, for everything it's done in the world, I actually think it has instilled a mindset that's very erosive to very good products and services. And hear me out for a minute, for everybody, who's like driving down the road and like smashing the brakes,
pitchforks,
and like all of a
pitchforks
sudden,
and torches.
Yeah, Googling my address. Like, Agile has a great thing. So consider this, right? People were just tired of sitting in meetings and never getting done. So all of a sudden they're like, well, look, we can work this way. And we talk about velocity, which is like a sexy sounding word, and we're getting all this stuff done. Here's the rub. Nobody ever walked in and said, here's how we're going to make sure we're getting the right stuff done. That's a humongous problem. When you are a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And so Agile was a development philosophy. Okay, so that's point number one.
Mm-hmm.
Now the rub I have with it, though, is that it's instilled this thinking where more is better. And where did this manifesto of fail fast, fail often come from? It came from the startup culture, and it came from Agile type thinking, right? That's wrong. And I will argue with anybody about this. Your goal should not be to fail. Your goal should be to learn. If your goal is to fail, I can almost guarantee you'll meet that goal.
Yeah.
Because it's a hell of a lot easier to fail than it is to learn something useful to take the next step towards progress. And guess what? Guess where that starts? Defining exactly, you and I were talking about this before we started recording, defining exactly what it is you're trying to do. Mm-hmm. That's not, so I beat this drum all the time. And I do this with designers, with product people, because it's not sexy work. It's not using the newest tool or hottest new technique, but it's the work that will almost every single time give you a guaranteed better chance of success.
Yeah, and that's the thing I see happening with product owners, especially in the startup world, because at Foundry we work a lot with startups, and a lot of times it's not a single owner; it's a couple of people. And I think, to your point, when we talk about failing fast and learning from it, I think the hardest thing is to agree on how to learn from it and how to say, okay, we are beginning learning, and now we are done learning, and now we are going to act. And that those people find those points at the same time, right?
Those people being
usually the founders.
The founders. Okay, sure.
Where it's like, okay, this thing didn't go so well. And there might be one other person saying, hang on, let me turn the knob a little bit more this way. And then somebody's got to say, okay, we're done with this, whatever it is, a feature, a rollout, whatever. We're not going to tweak it, edit it anymore. Yeah. We're going to be done, and we're going to synthesize that information that came through. And then we're going to now work on the next iteration or whatever. I find that, so to your point, failing fast, yes, don't fail. Don't try to fail, but try to learn. But you have to have a common language around what that learning means.
Yeah, for sure. No, yeah, so I love that. And in fact, when I talk about this, in a lot of the talks that I've given recently center around that very thing. It's interesting, too, because I didn't actually plan to talk about this. Yeah. But, some talks I've given recently, and even potentially some forthcoming talks that I will give, talks about selling your ideas as a designer, as a product person. And, spoiler alert, I start the talk with saying you will not sell anybody anything that's not already willing to buy what you have. But here's how you set yourself up for a greater chance of success when you're doing that. Somebody's got to be willing to listen to you, first of all. But then, all of this comes down to those goals. Yeah. And so I break it down into 3 parts. And this is interesting because this was a part of Aurelius version 1, which is long since been deep sixed, right? But